So in the realm of free speech, I just was curious about your thoughts on the backlash received by Professor Jordan Peterson on the University of Toronto campus, if you heard of the issue.
No, I haven't. Can you want to tell us a little bit?
Basically, he is in opposition of Bill C-16, and basically his refusal of using gender pronouns on the campus has received an enormous backlash, and there's videos on YouTube to sort of document.
This professor refused to use the pronouns that are being requested or demanded by transgender activists.
Yes.
Okay. Well, more power to him. Okay, is what I say. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. Okay, my PhD is in English literature. Okay, from Yale. Right, and I do not, and it's fine. Contribute to the language. Okay, write a poem. Okay, write a book. Okay, certainly. Okay, look at the way Gloria Steinem, her one great accomplishment is that she was a co-founder of Ms. Magazine. Okay, right, and there was a very important contribution made by by Ms. Okay, because before this, unlike the Romance languages, in English, you had Mrs. or Miss, okay? So if you were unmarried at age 40, 50, 60, you were still called Miss in this very demeaning way. Whereas in France, okay, a young girl is called Mademoiselle. In the minute a woman, a person gets into her 20s, and after that, she's called Madame. Okay, whether she's married or unmarried, Madame, she has dignity, she has authority, right? Right, and the same thing in Italian. You have your signorina if you're young, and then signora if you're old. It doesn't matter if you're married or unmarried. Okay, so Ms. was a very important contribution to the language. It took time to be absorbed. Okay, but this political agitation to change everyday common speech, are you kidding me? Okay, all right, people shouldn't be putting up with this for 1 second. What kind of nonsense is this? Absolute nonsense, okay? And these people who are searching for their own identity, okay, and want to impose on others, that is not my philosophy of the libertarian. That is an invasion and intrusion into other people's personal rights. So excuse us, the English language is owned, okay, by everyone, okay? It was created by great artists, Chaucer and Shakespeare, and Wordsworth and Joyce and so on. How dare you sniveling little, maniac, tell us how we're going to use pronouns. Go take a hike, I say to them. Okay, that's what I say.
All of a sudden, let's talk briefly about the free speech issues, the gender pronoun issues, what's happening in Canada around this bill C-16 and the gender provision in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Just bring us up to speed there. And I think we should spend probably no more than 10 minutes or so there, and then we'll move on to areas where you and I may not fully agree.
10 minutes would be plenty. Yeah. Canada moved at the federal level to institute some legislation that on the surface of it seems more or less in keeping with the extension of human rights protection to different groups that's been occurring, say, over the last 30 to 50 years. This time they extended protection to gender identity and gender expression. The first problem with that, although by no means the worst problem, is that gender expression is not a group. And as far as I can tell from reading the Ontario Human Rights Commission website policies, which the federal government announced that the provisions of Bill C-16 would be interpreted within, you can now provisionally be prosecuted under the hate crime legislation federally for criticizing someone's choice of fashion. And I'm not being cynical about that. That's the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies describe gender expression as the manner in which people present themselves while doing everyday activities like shopping, through their choice of clothes and dress. And the idea that requires protection of that magnitude, well, I think it's if you keep extending rights, all you do is weaken them. Rights are one person's rights are another person's responsibilities. And anyways, that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that the code, the Ontario provisions, which are like lurking behind the federal law and are already law in Ontario, require the use of these so-called preferred pronouns if someone requests them. And I have a variety of objections to that. The most fundamental of which is I believe that the manufactured pronouns, the Z and the Zer and the 50 sort of variants of those are.
Just for a moment, describe what you're referring to there, because I think even among my audience, this is an arcane topic. What are these manufactured pronouns?
Well, it's dogma, I would say, among the radical left that gender is a social construct and that there are multiple variants of gender identity. And some of those don't fit neatly into male-female classifications. The legislation says that people can inhabit any position on that spectrum or not be on the spectrum at all between male and female, which, of course, I find that particular claim essentially incomprehensible. Anyways, the theory is that people who are non-binary, which is the terminology, are entitled to be referred to by pronouns other than he or she, which include they, which would, I suppose, be the most moderate compromise, and then a host of other pronouns that have appeared basically out of the void over the last 10 years, including words like Z and Zer and her, which would be HIR, and them. And there's like 70 different sets of them.
Right.
And there's no agreement whatsoever on which ones should be used. And none of them have entered popular parlance because they are bad solutions to the problem. And the legislation nonetheless necessitates their use. And this is the first time that Canadian government has moved to make a particular kind of speech content mandatory. You know, there are certain limitations on speech, although not very many of them. But this is the first time out of the commercial realm that the actual contents of speech have been made mandatory. And my particular objection to this is that I believe, and I think I have good evidence for believing, that these made-up pronouns, these manufactured pronouns, are part of the lexicon of the radical postmodern / neo-Marxist left. And it's part of their general agenda to occupy the linguistic territory that we use for common parlance. And I don't like their philosophy. In fact, I regard it as reprehensible, to say the least. And because of that, I'm not willing to cede linguistic territory to them, certainly not by being forced to use ideologically saturated lexicon. And so I said I wouldn't do it. I made a video, 3 videos actually, complaining about, let's say, criticizing Bill C-16 and the background legislation, which also, by the way, makes employers responsible for any word that their employees utter that causes anyone any offense, intended or unintended, whether or not the employer knows that that utterance occurred, which seems to me a little bit on the draconian side, but I think is in keeping with the same philosophy, which is by no means pro-business. And there are other elements of what's going on in the background that are equally reprehensible. Ontario has set up social justice tribunals. That's their technical name, which gives you some insight into their purpose and into their staffing. One of those is the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and they've basically decided that they have the right to suspend normal legal and judicial procedure, and that they can more or less ascribe to themselves whatever powers they choose. And that's written in their policy statements. And so I'm not very happy about any of that. And so also at the same time, the University of Toronto made it mandatory for their human resources employees to undergo unconscious bias training against racism, which is also something, again, that I don't believe the science for documenting unconscious bias is anywhere near advanced to the point where it should be used as a diagnostic indicator of the potential prejudice of entire classes of people. I don't think there's any question that the tool is too weak to do that, certainly by the standards of appropriate psychometric tests. And there's certainly no evidence that these training programs that are popping up anywhere do any good with regards to prejudice, and a fair bit that they actually make it worse.
Right.
So anyways, I made 2 videos, posted them on my YouTube channel. Mostly, I did it fairly late at night, and I was just trying to think this stuff through, to get it straight in my head, and to lay out the argument. And well, the response to them was absolutely insane, really. There's 180 separate newspapers articles written, and 2 protests at the University of Toronto, and I received 2 warning letters from the administration, and a letter of censure from a number of my fellow academics and postdocs and graduate students at the University of Toronto. And it was news, literally. Well, yesterday, the Toronto Star published like a 3,000-word biography of me, and Toronto Life, which is, I suppose, our equivalent to New Yorker, although not in the same league, is going to publish a 5,000-word bio on me. And and then I've talked to Joe Rogan and a whole bunch of other people for podcasts. It's been crazy. But the reason for that is because I made something that was bubbling underneath the surface